through broken stone, through castle hall. All the seven legacies hidden from sight, lost in the echoes of endless night. Truth and power buried in the sand, waiting for a steady hand. The seventh legacy hidden from sight, lost in the echoes of endless night. Truth and power buried in the sand, waiting for a steady hand.
Max Emberley, The Seventh Legacy of Drayan. Book 1, Ancient Awakening. Chapter 2, Gelior.
The morning mist clung to the lake of blessings, curling low over the still water like pale smoke. The rising sun turned the ripples to silver, and the air carried the faint scent of pine and forge fire from the distant city of Olimbra. King Gideon sat upon a smooth boulder by the shore, wrapped in a cloak of wolf fur. His gaze was fixed on the training grounds below, where his son Leon sparred with his instructor. The metallic rhythm of their blades rang sharp in the cold morning air, echoing across the valley like a ritual song. Leon moved with the certainty of someone born to be seen. Every strike, every feint seemed designed to draw the eye, a performance as much as a contest. His blade caught the light, and his copper-red curls caught it as well, flaming brighter with each turn. Hair unmistakably Hannah's, a living echo of the king's wife. Even in exhaustion, he looked as though the world itself bent its attention toward him. Gideon's expression softened despite himself. There was so much of Hannah in that boy. Not only her hair, but the same green eyes that seemed to drink in the light. The same gentle lines of a face shaped more by warmth than war. Now, as Leon sparred with Roflick, one of the king's most trusted men, Gideon felt his thoughts slipping away, 30 years into the past. He had been only 19 then, the sole heir to the throne of Gelior. His father, Baudrian IV, was a giant of a man, and Gideon had inherited every inch of his formidable build. He stood head and shoulders above most men of the realm, his frame broad and unyielding, his arms and legs like the pillars of a fortress. It was said that he could crush an enemy's throat with a single hand. Like his father, he had already earned renown across the kingdom of 1,000 lakes, a warrior of promise, a future warlord destined to unite the tribes. Yet, despite all his victories, one thing was missing: a Stadra, a loyal woman to stand beside him. Without a family, a warrior might be feared, but a king without a wife could never be truly respected. Finding a bride, however, was no simple task in Gelior. The land of warriors suffered from a cruel imbalance. There were far fewer women than men. Generations of war had taken their toll. The tribes of Gelior, though bound under one crown, were never truly at peace. They raided and fought, burned each other's villages, slaughtered their enemies to the last soul. Each conquest left fewer and fewer daughters in its wake. Thus, when the time came for young men to take wives, they competed fiercely for what few women remained. Some sought brides in secret pacts, others through gold or blood. But most waited for spring harvest, a tradition older than the crown itself. Despite its name, the spring harvest had little to do with crops. It was a gathering, a great festival held in a different region each year, where thousands of Geliors from every tribe came together. There were games and feasts, duels and races, dancing and music that echoed deep into the night. And among all this celebration, The wealthiest and most powerful families would present their daughters, not unlike treasures displayed at a market. For the young heirs of Gelior, it was the season of choosing. For Gedeon, it was the season his life changed forever. Gedeon had decided he would go to the great gathering, the spring harvest, and seek his bride there. But he would do it his way, not as others did. He had grown up in a palace where his mother and father, when they were still alive, barely spoke to each other except out of duty. Their union was not born of love, but of alliance, a pact between two families bound by title, not affection. He had sworn to himself that his marriage would be different. He wanted a woman who would not see the crown before she saw the man, a woman whose worth lay not in her dowry or bloodline, but in her soul. So he went to the harvest in disguise. He took with him two of his most trusted men. One, 𝐿rinn, was to play the part of a wealthy landowner from the southern marshes. The other, 𝐼𝐴rnold, his loyal companion in arms. Gideon himself dressed as a common servant in 𝐿rinn's household, plain linen, worn boots, a rough wool cloak that hid his stature. That year the festival was held deep within Gelior, in the city of 𝐓𝐿𝐼𝐴, a settlement resting on the quiet plain. When they arrived, even Gedeon was astonished. He had never before seen such crowds. Laughter, drums, and music echoing over the fields, banners of every tribe fluttering in the wind. 𝐿rinn and 𝐼𝐴rnold quickly vanished into the revelry, drinking and testing their strength in contests, while Gedeon began his quiet search. He watched the daughters of noble houses, one after another. Each was beautiful, adorned in silks and jewels, but none stirred his heart. Their eyes passed over him without interest. After all, what was a servant to them? As dusk approached, disheartened, he decided to find his companions and return to the capital. Perhaps another year, he thought. But fate had other plans. Passing through the crowd, he came upon a straw effigy of Lil, the goddess of crops and harvest, patron of farmers and life. Though shaped in human form, she was most often depicted as a great bird, eagle-like in aspect, a symbol of watchfulness and renewal. Such a creature was among the most commonly chosen totems of the Geliorians. Around her, a circle of young women danced, their movements wild and free, to the rhythm of drums and pipes. Gideon pushed his way forward through the spectators until he stood near the front, his gaze fixed on the dancers. And then he saw her. A flash of flame among the green and gold. A girl with hair like burning copper, curls leaping in the sunlight as she spun, her laughter carrying above the crowd. Her spirit blazed brighter than the bonfires themselves. Her name, he would later learn, was Hannah. In that moment, the world fell away. He could not look elsewhere. Her presence held him fast. And when her eyes finally met his, a spark passed between them that neither could deny. She paused in her dance, then, to everyone's surprise, ran straight toward him. Grinning, she seized his rough hand and pulled him into the circle. "Well then, giant," she teased, "what's your name?" For a heartbeat, he forgot who he was. Gedenor, he managed at last. Gedenor? A curious name, she laughed. Tell me, Gedenor, can you dance? With a woman like you, he said before he could stop himself, I can learn quickly. She smiled, and before he knew it, she was guiding him through the steps, their movements clumsy at first, but soon in perfect harmony. They danced as though they had always known each other. When the music stopped, Hannah brushed a strand of hair from her face and laughed breathlessly. It's been a long time since I've danced like that, she said. Then, tilting her head, Tell me, Gedenor, would you like a drink? "I don't know if I should, my lady," he replied, still playing his part. "I'm only a humble servant." "And what does that matter?" she asked lightly. "Here, everyone has the right to celebrate and meet new people." Those words struck him deeply. She was the first woman he'd met who saw no difference in rank, only the person before her. He followed her to a nearby tavern where they drank fresh pear cider, talking for what felt like hours. She spoke with wit and wisdom, her laughter bright and easy, her thoughts deeper than he'd expected. By the end of the evening, he knew this was the woman he wanted, the one he'd been searching for. At last he dared to ask, "Tell me, Hannah, how much gold would your father ask for your hand? Suppose my master were interested." She grinned slyly. "You can tell your master, 𝐵𝐺𝐻𝐸, that no amount of gold will buy me." "Oh, and if he were very, very rich?" "Even then," she said, leaning forward, "he would need more than gold. He'd need a strong hand. Only such a man could hope to earn mine." "A strong hand?" he echoed. She gave no further answer, only smiled. "Ask around. You'll learn what I mean." Then she rose abruptly, glancing toward the crowd. "I must go. My brothers will be looking for me." And just like that, she was gone, leaving Gideon alone, her laughter still ringing in his ears. That night, he sent Olwen and Tornold to ask about her. By dawn, they returned with answers. Hannah, the red-haired girl, belonged to the small Godian tribe, dwellers of the Green Isles. Their women, flame-haired and striking, were said to be touched by the gods. To meet one on the road was a sign of fortune. To marry one was to be blessed by heaven itself. But the Godian were few, and their daughters fiercely protected. Wealth alone could not win them, only strength. For generations, the tribe had held a tournament at each spring harvest, where suitors would fight for the right to wed a Godian maiden. That's what she meant, Gideon realized, smiling to himself. A strong hand indeed. At last, something stirred in his chest. Excitement, purpose, perhaps even destiny. He would enter the tournament as his master's champion. And when he won, when he proved himself before gods and men alike, he would reveal who he truly was. The next morning, Gideon went to the tournament grounds and ordered Olwen to place his name on the list of contenders. It turned out that no fewer than 20 men had entered the contest for Hannah's hand, some of them his age, others older, and a few young enough to still bear the rashness of boys. Yet one name rose above the rest: Dandin of the Sorf tribe. The crowd roared his name as he appeared, a tall, broad-shouldered man, perhaps a few years Gideon's senior, and only slightly shorter. From Olwen, Gideon learned that Dandin was considered the finest warrior in the eastern lands of Gelior, the pride of his people, born of a chieftain's line. They called him the Barbarian for the savage fury of his raids on rival tribes. To most, he was the certain victor, for few could match his strength, speed, and endurance. But Gideon feared no man, nor did he ever see another as a rival truly worthy of him. Without hesitation, he stepped into the tournament. When Hannah saw him among the competitors, her eyes widened in disbelief. And when the names were announced and the warriors stood in line, their gazes met once again. The girl's lips curled slightly, the faintest of smiles, discreet, so no one would notice. Yet her look said, "So, your master has decided to fight for me after all?" Gideon met her eyes with the same quiet admiration as before, though this time his gaze carried something more: certainty, possession, as though the red-haired lady was already a prize he meant to claim. The tournament lasted nearly the whole day, broken only by short pauses. With each round, the number of challengers dwindled until only the strongest remained. And the more Gelior fought, the more people turned their eyes toward him. At first, the crowd cheered only for Dandan, their champion and pride. But as the young stranger, a supposed servant from some unknown rich man household, continued to triumph, their loyalties began to shift. They saw the way he fought, each movement purposeful, each strike measured, as if the fate of a kingdom hung upon his victory. His determination burned like a visible flame. By the time only 5 contenders remained, the people had found a new favorite. When the sun began to set and the air turned cool, the final round was called. Only 2 men stood left upon the field, Dandan and Gelior. The duel was to be fought bare-handed. No weapons, no armor, nothing but flesh, bone, and will. The clash was brutal and long. Dust rose around them in thick clouds, sweat and blood mixing with the earth. Dandan fought like a beast cornered, wild and merciless, while Gelior countered with precision and balance born of years of training. But then, a slip, a moment too slow. Dandan caught him in a crushing grip and drove him to the ground. When the crowd erupted in cheers, Gelior lay stunned, the breath knocked out of him. He had never been defeated in hand-to-hand combat. For the first time, the prince tasted the bitterness of loss. His pride lay shattered, and with it his hope of winning the woman who had captured his heart. He remembered it vividly, even now. The quiet evening that followed, the murmurs of celebration fading into the distance while he sat alone by the riverbank. The waters of the Gelioran plains ran dark beneath the moon, and in them he saw his own reflection, a warrior humbled, a man stripped of certainty. And then, as clearly as if it had happened yesterday, Gelior remembered the moment when a young, blonde-haired boy appeared before him, no older than 12 or 13, with eyes bright as polished amber. The boy introduced himself as Willie. He said he had come to the festival with his parents, who were merchants from one of the Western Isles. Willie spoke quickly, almost breathlessly, as if afraid that silence might erase what he had to say. From him, Gelior learned that Dandan's victory had not been clean. Before their final bout, the warrior had drunk an infusion made from wolfberries. Among Geliorian shaman circles, the wolfberries were well known for their power to numb pain. Even the smallest draught could leave a person almost insensible to pain for an entire day. But even that revelation paled beside what came next. The boy told him of an ancient custom, one few still remembered, a tradition belonging to Hannah's tribe. A second chance, granted to those who had lost the contest for a woman's hand. Within 3 moons of the spring harvest, any defeated suitor had the right to challenge the victor again, but not through ceremony or honor, but through blood and strength. If he succeeded in taking the woman from her betrothed by force, she would become his wife, and the victor's claim would be forfeit. Few had ever dared. The champions who won the tournaments knew of the custom, and spent the following months strengthening their villages, surrounding their brides with warriors and watchmen, waiting for the night when someone might come to reclaim what was lost. Gelior had listened in silence, still staring at the dark water. Then, as if struck by a sudden thought, he looked up at the boy and asked why he was telling him all this. Willie only smiled faintly, and his voice grew softer. He said he knew that between Gelior and Hannah there existed something far greater than what bound her to Dandan. The words struck Gideon like a blade. He hesitated, studying the boy's face in the dim moonlight, and asked how he could possibly know such a thing. How he could know that he, and not his master, was the one who fell in love with her. But Willie only gave a strange, knowing smile and said, "I know everything that happens on this festival." And before Gideon could speak again, the boy was gone, vanished as suddenly as he had appeared. No footsteps, no shadow, no sign of his passing. Only the wind remained, rustling the tall grass by the river and carrying with it the echo of the boy's final words. That night, something within Gideon changed. The grief that had chained him moments before hardened into resolve, then into fury. The young prince rose from the riverbank, his eyes cold, his heart set aflame by a single thought. He would not accept defeat. Not to a man like Dandon, the one who cheated, not when the gods themselves had placed Hannah in his path. That night, as the festival drew to its end, Gideon saw Hannah one last time. She belonged now, at least by law and custom, to Dandon. Yet, when they met in secret under the straw statue of the harvest goddess, the same place where they had danced, her smile was still warm, though touched with sadness. "What a pity, Gednor," she said quietly. "Your master lost his chance to be with me. Perhaps the gods meant me for another." "Hannah," he murmured, stepping closer. "My master does not take kindly to defeat, especially when it means losing something, or someone precious. He still believes he can have you, even if it takes strength and blood." Her eyes widened. "You mean the old law. But how do you know of it? Does it matter?" he said softly. She hesitated, her voice barely above a whisper. "Your master would need an army to take me from Dandon and his men. Then let him come with one. Wait for him, Hannah," Gideon replied, and gently drew her into his arms. Careful, as if afraid his strength might break her fragile form. For a moment, she did not resist. Perhaps she too felt that something unspoken bound them, something that went beyond names or rank. When they parted, Gideon rode back to the capital with his companions. But sleep would not come to him. Each night he lay awake, haunted by visions of Dandon's hands on her, of her laughter belonging to another. And so he made his decision. With his father's leave, Prince Gideon gathered 3 royal units under his command. He sent scouts into the wilds to learn all they could of Dandon, his tribe, his stronghold, the way his men fought. When 2 full moons had passed since the harvest festival, Gideon donned his royal armor once more and took up his weapon, not the sword or axe of common warriors, but a silver-edged glaive, long and elegant, the mark of his lineage. Then, as the true heir to the throne of Gelior, he rode out at the head of his army, not as a disguised servant, but as a king-to-be marching to reclaim the woman who had stolen his heart. Gideon had never witnessed it himself, but he often imagined the look on Dandon's face, and on the faces of his men, when they realized that the army marching toward their city gates was none other than the royal host of Gelior, led by the crown prince himself. With little effort, Gideon seized the city within a single day. And in the heat of vengeance, driven by fury, wounded pride, and the sting of his dishonor during the tournament, he showed no mercy. He ordered the city to be burned to the ground, the men slain, and the women and children taken to the capital as captives. In Dandon's own palace, Gideon fought him once more. This time, he fought with no weapon. His bare hands crushed the skull of the man who had wronged him. Beyond the hall, in a guarded chamber protected by a dozen of Dandon's warriors, none of whom survived Gideon's wrath, he found her. Hannah. He could still recall her face that day. The disbelief, the trembling smile as she looked at him from across the blood-stained room. "You've risen quickly, 𝐵𝐴𝐴𝐻," she said playfully, her voice soft despite the chaos around them. "From a mere servant to the Prince of Gelior." Then, after a pause, she added with a quiet smile, "Or should I say, Gideon?" For the first time in his life, he loved the sound of his own name, when spoken by the lips of the woman the gods had destined for him. "I told you to wait," he whispered as he lifted her into his arms. "I've come back, Hannah. I've come back for you." His armor was heavy with blood and ash, the true marks of victory. Yet in his arms, he carried the greatest prize of all, the woman who had set his heart aflame. He returned to the capital with her and made her his wife. And now, after 30 years of marriage and 4 children, Gideon still loved Hannah with the same fire that once drove him to conquer a city for her. Not a single day passed without him thanking the heavens for intertwining their fates. Yet beneath that softness of look, in his son Leon lived a temper he knew all too well. Quick, fierce, unrelenting. Hadrian, his firstborn, had always mirrored him most closely, tall, broad-shouldered, black-haired, his face carved in hard lines that seemed made to command silence. Of all his children, Hadrian was considered the most striking, the kind of beauty that unsettled rather than comforted. Leon, on the other hand, was a different sort of fire. He had his mother's grace sealed in those red curls and delicate features, but his father's heart, impulsive, proud, and restless. Though smaller in stature than Hadrian, his shoulders were broad, his hands large and scarred from training, the hands of a warrior rather than a courtly prince. Yet behind the strength there was vanity. Leon thrived on attention like others thrived on air. He could charm with a smile and wound with a glance. Praise was his nourishment, and he could not bear to go hungry for long. In Olymbra, the great capital of Gelior, people spoke of him with both admiration and unease. They called him the Red Hawk for his speed, his temper, and for the flaming hair that marked him as Hannah's son, but also the Mirror Prince, because wherever he went he demanded reflection, eyes upon him, words about him, stories circling his name. He was brilliant, yes, but arrogant, charismatic, but selfish. And when bested, his pride flared like a spark in dry grass. Gideon saw through all of it, and though he would never admit it aloud, part of him admired the boy's unyielding hunger. It reminded him of himself, of that same reckless fire that once burned too bright to be contained. But he also knew the danger of such flames. Leon had spent his entire life in another's shadow. Even now, with Hadrian far away in the eastern provinces, his presence lingered like a ghost. Every compliment Leon received carried a silent comparison, every triumph an echo of a greater one that had come before. And though the boy laughed and boasted and basked in his reflection, Gideon could see the truth. Leon's pride was a shield for his wounds. Gideon's fingers tightened on the sword beside him, the leather worn smooth by years of war. He knew that hunger. He had lived it. He had let it shape him and nearly destroy him. "He burns too quickly," he murmured under his breath, "just as I once did." Below, the clash of steel came to an end. Leon disarmed his instructor with a final sweeping strike. His chest rose and fell with quick breaths. Sweat gleamed on his brow, but his grin was radiant, victorious. When his eyes found his father's across the field, he lifted his blade in salute, half triumph, half plea for recognition. Gideon rose from his place by the water. The lake behind him shimmered like a mirror, split between sky and reflection, light and shadow bound together, inseparable. Snow crunched beneath their boots as Gideon and Leon made their way back toward the royal hall. The training grounds lay behind them, swallowed by mist that drifted in from the lake. Ahead, through the thinning veil of snow, the wooden spires of the palace rose against the pale afternoon sky, a dark fortress carved from timber and pride. Built upon an ancient hill that overlooked the Lake of Blessings, the palace was a marvel of Geliorian craft. Its towering beams were engraved with the shapes of sacred beasts, wolves, bears, stags, and eagles, each a guardian spirit of the realm. The scent of burning pine drifted from the great hearths within, mingling with the sharp, cold air of the mountains. For a moment Gideon slowed his pace, letting his gaze wander across the lake. The water stretched out like a sheet of blue steel, reflecting the distant peaks in the dying light of day. Far beyond, between the cliffs, shimmered the river of 𝐼𝐶, the only vein that connected 𝐵𝐿imbra to the sea. Narrow, treacherous, and as fiercely guarded as the king's own crown. Leon walked beside him, his breath rising in pale clouds. His reddish curls glowed faintly in the fading light, and though exhaustion lined his face, his stride remained proud, defiant, the mark of a prince who believed the world owed him victory. "You fought well today," Gideon said at last, his tone heavy but not unkind. Leon glanced at him, the corner of his mouth twitching. "I was taught by the best." The king said nothing. He simply looked ahead, toward the great doors of his hall, where torches burned and banners fluttered in the wind. Blue and silver, the colors of the royal house. Inside, warmth awaited them. The great hall of 𝐵𝐿imbra glowed with the warmth of fire and mead. Shadows of antlers and banners danced along the carved beams where wolves, eagles, and stags watched silently from the wood. The smell of roasted meat lingered in the air, mingling with the resinous smoke of pine. At the long oak table sat King Gedion's kin and council. There was Mevrin, the king's most trusted adviser, an old warrior with a weathered face whose hands still bore the scars of steel. Beside him lounged Tanner, Gedion's elder brother, his dark hair streaked with gray, his laughter too loud, and his words too bold after a few mugs of ale. Tanner had long ago renounced his right to the throne, declaring himself unfit to rule, but ever willing to serve. He had always been a soldier at heart, a man who preferred the clash of blades to the weight of crowns. While Gideon ascended to kingship, Tanner took an oath of loyalty to his younger brother and swore never to break it. He settled in 𝐵𝐿imbra with his beautiful wife and their 3 daughters, though he remained one of Gelior's finest warriors and a commander of fearsome repute. In the years of conquest, when the banner of 𝐼𝐚𝐥 tribe flew over burning strongholds, and the rivers ran red, it was Tanner who often led the charge beside his brother. Those were days of glory and blood, days both men still spoke of with laughter and pride. But since the birth of Gedion's 3rd son, Felix, the wars had ceased. The king had turned his gaze inward, to family, to rule, to legacy. Yet whenever wine loosened their tongues, the brothers would jest of the old days, of sleepless nights beneath rain-soaked tents, of battles fought shoulder to shoulder. And Tanner would always end the same way, pounding his fist to his chest with a wolfish grin. "If ever the need comes again, brother, I'll don my armor before the dawn and ride at your side." Further down, 2 younger princes, Felix and Yanis, were bent over the table, building a tower from scraps of carved wood, their game a fortress besieged by laughter. At the far end, Hannah sat quietly, her hands busy with a hoop of linen stretched tight in an embroidery frame. She was threading a golden crest, the sigil of 𝐓𝐿𝐼𝐻, a blazing sun over a wolf's head. It was her way of keeping her mind at peace amid men's noise. The flicker of the hearthlight played gently over her auburn hair. Then the heavy doors groaned open. Gideon entered first, the weight of his fur cloak still glistening with melted snow. Leon followed close behind, his red curls bright in the torchlight, shoulders squared, chin high, both of them carrying themselves like men returning from battle rather than training. The talk at the table stilled. All eyes turned toward them. For generations, the 𝐓𝐿𝐼𝐻 tribe had ruled Gelior with iron and flame. They were a clan born of conquest, warriors from the southwestern hills, where the air tasted of snow and steel, and every child learned to hold a blade before he could write his name. A century ago, their forefathers rose against the Indu tribe, the scholars and mystics who had ruled before them, and tore them down in a storm of blood and fire. Since that time, 5 kings of 𝐓𝐿𝐼𝐻 had sat upon Gelior's throne, and none had ruled with mercy. Their reign was one of iron discipline, their wars endless. The other tribes whispered of them as the Fireborn, claiming that their blood ran hotter than the forged steel they wielded. Even now, long after the wars of unification had ended, no one dared challenge their rule. No one, except for the murmurs from the eastern lands, where rebellion still simmered beneath a banner of independence. Tanner raised his mug, smirking. Look at them, the wolf and the tiger, striding in like conquerors after years lost to the wilds. A ripple of laughter followed, though not all of it kind. The titles carried the weight of legend. Gideon, the wolfbane, named so after the wild hunts that had drenched the southern snows in blood during his youth. Leon, the tiger, had earned his name as a boy when he dragged home the carcass of a winter tiger from the high forests, not as fearsome as the black bear his brother Hadrian once slew, yet enough to win him both fame and envy. Gideon halted before the table, a faint grin cutting across his beard. At least, he said, his voice low but sharp, we are still capable of drawing blood, brother. You, on the other hand, have grown so fond of palace comforts, I doubt you could even lift your armor now. The hall burst into laughter, louder this time, richer, filling the space between the wooden walls. Even Tanner laughed, shaking his head. Perhaps you're right, he said, raising his cup, but I still drink better than you. On that, we may agree, Gideon replied, clapping his brother's shoulder before taking his seat at the head of the table. How was the training? Hannah asked softly. Her voice was calm, gentle, like the stillness before snowfall. Leon came up behind her, bent down, and pressed a kiss to her forehead. One day you'll be proud of me, Mother, he said with a grin, that same confident spark in his eyes that reminded her so much of his father, and yet the warmth of his voice was wholly her own. He fights as though he were born with a weapon in his hand, Gideon said proudly, grabbing a slab of roasted meat from the platter before him. He tore into it with his teeth, grease glinting in the firelight. Good, Tanner interjected from across the table. He should train from dawn till dusk. In a few moons, people will begin gathering in Maris, and your son will need to prove himself worthy of candidacy for the title of High Father. Tanner's tone carried a weight that silenced the laughter around the table. The mention of Maris, that ancient, sacred city, always did. He was referring to the 3-week gathering that preceded every election of the High Father. Nobles, scholars, and warlords from all corners of the New Lands would travel to Maurus to witness the trials. Grand tournaments, strategy councils, and debates before the eyes of the council itself. It was not enough to wield a sword well. A candidate had to show mastery in the art of statecraft, diplomacy, wisdom, and restraint to prove himself the best among the best, worthy of leading the council and commanding the respect of all 4 kingdoms. "We'll be ready," Gideon thought. "The gods will favor us. We'll win these elections, and then we'll show them the true power of Gelior." It was one of his greatest dreams. Beyond the desire to be remembered as gloriously as his father, Baudrian IV, Gideon longed to see his kingdom rise again, to see Gelior stand not merely as one of the 4, but above them all. No Geliorian had worn the mantle of High Father in over a century. To Gideon, that was not coincidence. It was proof. Proof that the world had forgotten them, that they no longer feared the kingdom of 1,000 lakes. In the Council of Maurus, the 25 Geliorian seats had long been the quietest voices, ignored and overruled by those who fancied themselves civilized. People have grown too fond of peace, he thought bitterly. Instead of bleeding on battlefields, they scheme in shadows, plotting through politics and words. Instead of dreaming of conquest, they argue over chains and slaves, as if such things mattered. Slavery has always been and will always be. The strong rule the weak. That is the law of nature, the law of gods themselves. His jaw tightened as he stared into the firelight. "That cursed council," he muttered inwardly. "I'll show them the path they've forgotten. I'll remind them what power truly means. I'll change everything." Sleep rarely came easily to him these days. Every night, the same thoughts circled in his mind. The image of the council chambers, the banners of foreign kings fluttering where his own should have hung. In his dreams, he saw 𝐓𝐿𝐴𝐽𝐻's sigil, the wolf and the rising sun, raised above Maurus itself, the city of all and none, bowing finally to his will. Suddenly, a guard named Brondon, one of Gideon's men, burst into the hall, snow still clinging to his cloak. "A package for the king," he announced, breath puffing in the cold air. Gideon looked up with a frown. "A package for me?" he said. "Yes, your grace." The guard's voice was steady, but his eyes betrayed a trace of unease. "They asked that it be brought straight to your chamber." "Bring it in," Gideon ordered. "Set it in my room." They stood a moment later in the king's private chamber. Gideon, Meverin, Tanner, and Leon. On the broad table between them sat a single, heavy chest, dark wood blackened with salt and time. None of them moved at first. The 4 men simply stared, measuring the object, measuring each other. "I wasn't expecting any deliveries," Gideon said at last. "Where did it come from?" Meverin asked. "Brondon says it arrived by ship from the south," Gideon answered, recounting what he had been told by the warrior who'd brought it in. "Who sent it?" Tanner demanded, leaning forward. "No name," Gideon said. "A boy from the ship. Brondon says a stranger in a cloak handed it to him and asked that it be delivered to me personally." "Then what are we waiting for? Open it and see!" Leon burst out, impatience cutting his voice. "I will," Meverin said, hands calm as he reached for the lid. "Who knows what danger might lie within?" He lifted the chest's heavy iron clasp. A sour, metallic stench pushed at them the instant the lid opened. All 4 made ugly faces and reflexively covered their noses. "What is that smell?" Tanner muttered. Gideon leaned over and peered into the box. He drew out a bundle wrapped in a strip of horsehide. Carefully, deliberately, He unrolled the leather. Gods, Tanner breathed. Leon looked away for a breath, twisting his mouth as if to hide the reaction. Mevrin drew in a long, steady inhalation. In Gedion's hand lay a severed finger, pale and stiff. On its bone a silver ring glittered, etched with words. On the inside of the horsehide, written in dark, clotted blood, someone had scrawled, "Blood for blood. Time to pay debts." Silence fell. Each man's mind spun with the same question. What did this mean? Interesting. Whose limb is it? The red-haired prince finally managed. I know, Gelior said, his voice low and hard as flint. He held the finger up so the others could see the ring more plainly. The inscription read, Ravi and Usra. That motto, the gods are with us, that belongs to our uncle Tanner, Gelior said. He did not need to explain which uncle. The name hung in the air. Uncle Rabard? Tanner repeated, disbelief cracking his tone. Aye, Gideon confirmed. It's his finger. Father wore a similar ring, only his was gold. Who would cut off his finger? And why? Mevrin asked. If this is true, then is he even alive? Father, Leon said, voice high with fury. This is a threat. Someone has struck at our kin. This is treachery. I know, son. My uncle hath been murdered, and a challenge has been laid upon my house, Gelior replied, every syllable a blade. He turned his eyes to Mevrin. We must find the sender. Meverin's gaze swept the chamber, the older man methodical even now. He examined the ring, the handwriting in blood, the crude wrapping. I will see to it. We do not yet know who is behind this, but they have awakened a sleeping wolf. He fixed Gelior with a look that made the king's jaw set. I will find the traitor, Gelior said, voice dripping with menace. I will flay him, strip the flesh from his bones, and I will boil his meat in a pot until there is nothing left but a story to tell. The threat sat between them like hot iron. This must remain secret, Mevrin said, turning to each of them in turn. None of this must leave this room. Not a word. You are right, Mevrin, Gelior agreed, meeting each pair of eyes. Until we know who stands behind this, we trust no one. The sky over Olimbra was, as always, a dull gray, and the streets of the city were thick with mist. Two women walked through the damp air, cloaks of fur wrapped tightly around them, their boots crunching softly over the cobblestones as they made their way toward the grand temple at the city's heart to pay homage to Yanni, the goddess of family and children. One of the women was Hannah, her hair a vivid flame of copper that caught the faint light even through the haze. Beside her walked her elder sister, 𝐓𝐴𝐴𝐼𝐻, 10 years her senior, with long dark brown hair woven into a thick braid that fell neatly across her shoulder and down the front of her chest. Both women moved with quiet purpose, the city seeming to hold its breath around them as they approached the temple steps. The wooden stairs creaked underfoot as they climbed into the round, timbered sanctuary, guarded on every side by vigilant soldiers. Inside, worshippers clustered around small altars, lighting candles, offering gifts, and kneeling in prayerful songs that echoed softly against the walls. Hannah and 𝐓𝐴𝐴𝐼𝐻 chose a bench to the side, near a small figurine depicting Yanni surrounded by 5 children. The warm glow of the altar candles flickered across their faces, casting their features in gentle light. My sister! I dreamed of him again, Hannah whispered, careful that no one beyond their circle could hear. Of Hadrian? 𝐓𝐴𝐴𝐼𝐻 asked, her gaze fixed on the goddess's figure. Yes, he called to me again, asked me to prepare a place for him. Hannah's voice was low, tinged with worry. I don't understand it, but I fear for him. You shouldn't have sent him east, 𝐓𝐴𝐴𝐼𝐻 said, her tone even but firm. I know, Hannah admitted, eyes falling to her hands. Perhaps it was a mistake. I only wanted to keep him safe. Here in the capital, so many whisper. They say he is cursed by the gods. that he carries death wherever he goes. I feared someone might wish him harm. Far from home, he is even more vulnerable. For years, no one from Gedion's line has been able to quell the rebellion in the Highlands. Your husband, in his naivety, has sent your son to what may well be his death, 𝐼𝐴𝐻𝐿 said, her words sharp as a blade. Hannah's hands clenched in her lap. I will try to persuade Gelion to send someone after him, to bring him back to the capital. Don't fool yourself into thinking Gelion will listen, 𝐼𝐴𝐻𝐿 replied. He acts only according to his vision, and if he has decided that his firstborn will one day return in full glory and triumph, he will wait for that moment, even if the world falls apart around him. Hannah looked down at the flickering candles, thinking of her son and the dangers that awaited him. A stubborn fire rose in her chest. Hannah had to admit that her sister was right. She did not like doing that, admitting her mistakes, or conceding that someone else might see more clearly than she did. But 𝐼𝐴𝐻𝐿's words rang true. Gelion had no reason to heed her pleas about Hadrian. Since childhood, Hannah had been raised as little more than a commodity. Even as a girl, she had known what her fate would be, to become the face of her clan. She had grown up knowing that when she turned 16, she would be sent to the spring harvest, where men of rank and valor came to claim brides as trophies of their bloodlines. Her youth had been spent imagining which warrior might win her hand, how she would be given away like an item to be traded, to live with a stranger and bear him children. No one in her family could have imagined that her chosen suitor would turn out to be a prince, the future king of Gelior himself. Yet Hannah had long accepted that women in Gelior had little say in their destinies, unless they were priestesses or shamans. Why did I ever imagine Gelion would listen to me now? She thought bitterly. Here, in the temple where people came seeking purification, to wash away their sins, to beg the gods for mercy, Hannah felt anything but cleansed. She felt only anger. Anger at herself, and at her sister sitting quietly beside her. It's easy for you to speak, 𝐼𝐴𝐻𝐿. You're just the wife of some warrior from an unknown village. I am the wife of a king. It's easy for you to judge me and the choices I've made. But it was I, on the day I married Gelion, who was sentenced to make the hard decisions, to weigh every word, every step. I am the one who bears the burden of having given the king 4 heirs, and the one who must answer for their lives. Her thoughts churned as she rose and walked toward the large bronze basin at the center of the temple. Kneeling, she dipped her hands into the cool water, washing her palms and face as part of the ritual of offering. Droplets slid down her cheeks like a mockery of tears. Of all the gods, it was 𝐼𝐴𝐻𝐿 whom she honored most in recent months, the one she offered her gifts and whispered her prayers. All because of Hadrian, her firstborn, the son of her soul. He was her light, her reflection, her continuation. Even Gelion could never fully understand the bond between them. From the moment he was born, she had felt as though a part of herself had taken new life in him. She loved him for many reasons, but above all because he resembled the young Gelion, the man who had once stolen her heart, the one she had believed the gods themselves had sent to her. She still remembered the sleepless nights, spent in prayer and ritual, when she had feared being married to Dandon, a man whose very presence made her tremble. She had begged the gods to let her see Gelion again, even though she had believed him to be only a common peasant. It didn't matter, she had told herself. I will marry his master and live under the same roof, and I will see the one who holds my heart. When Gelion returned for her, when he took her from Dandon's grasp, not as a peasant, but as the famed prince of Gelior, she had believed it a divine miracle. Even if she were to spend the rest of her life in prayer and thanksgiving, it would never be enough to repay the gods for such a gift. After they married, Hannah was certain their union had been blessed, sanctified by the will of the heavens. And when Hadrian was born, he became her greatest treasure, the living proof that love, even in a world built on duty and power, could still be holy. Later, when Hadrian began to lose his mind and act strangely, Hannah started begging the gods to bring him back to normal. But when nothing changed, when her beloved son began doing and saying even stranger things, she became convinced that someone had sinned. Either she herself or Gideon. And what had happened to Hadrian was the punishment they both had to bear for their transgressions. Fearing how the people might react to her son's behavior, she and Gideon decided to send him east. To Gideon, it was a perfect opportunity, a chance for their son to prove himself in battle, to crush the rebellion that had been simmering there for years, and to return to the capital in triumph. But to Hannah, it was a way to protect her son from prying eyes and the whispers that had begun to follow him through the palace halls. She still remembered that day vividly, the day the people of the capital and the royal family gathered in the palace courtyard to bid farewell to the young prince, dressed entirely in black. The air had been heavy with pride and dread alike. "Mother, I'll return soon," Hadrian had told her, holding her tightly in his strong arms. "I will fulfill the will of the gods and come back. Don't miss me too much, because I'll feel it, even thousands of miles away." "Go, my son," Gideon had declared, his voice resounding across the courtyard, "and show those rebels in the highlands the true might of our clan. Do not return until the enemy is crushed and victory is yours." That farewell haunted Hannah's dreams as much as the image of her son calling to her, asking her to prepare him a place. The same words, over and over again. Her fear grew with every passing day, gnawing at her heart like a living thing. She prayed to Yanni, begged her to watch over her son, to grant him special protection, to let them meet again, and not to take her child away from her. Next to her husband, Hadrian was everything. She feared to admit it, even to herself, but though she loved Leon, Felix, and Giannis, it was not the same love. What she felt for Hadrian was different, deeper, older, something beyond the bounds of mere duty. Perhaps what she felt towards her other sons was simple maternal care. Perhaps it was the instinctive devotion expected of a queen and mother of princes. Yet while Leon was Gideon's favorite, Felix was the cherished child of her sister Phaenia, and Giannis the pride of their grandfather, Baudrian, when he was still alive, and Hadrian had always been hers, her firstborn, her heart's truest bond. As Hannah stepped out of the temple, she paused for a moment on the terrace and looked up into the gray, clouded sky. "The gods have already taken one of my sons. In a few days I'll lose another," she whispered. But her sister, Phaenia, who was walking just behind her, heard the words. She stopped as well and took Hannah's hands in hers. "Hannah, you won't lose Felix. I'm going with him, and with Leon. I promised you I wouldn't leave his side, not for a moment. I'll make sure the girl's family is trustworthy, and if anything feels wrong, if even the smallest detail raises my suspicions, we'll turn back at once." She meant to comfort her, but her words could not ease the heaviness in Hannah's chest. The ache had settled deep within her, unmoved by promises. This year, Gideon had thrown himself wholly into the elections at Maurus. He was utterly convinced that a man of Gelior must become the next High Father, and he had chosen Leon to be that man. Yet before the elections even began, he sought to strengthen his son's position, to secure support, or win new allies. And so, his gaze turned toward Travia. The Travians were held in the highest esteem across Maurus. Since the founding of the council, 15 of the 29 High Fathers had come from their kingdom. It was the Travians who had poured the most wealth into the council's treasury, who commanded vast networks of influence across the Purple Isle and beyond, and who, as Gideon often said, were the easiest to persuade and the easiest to buy. Yet for generations the people of Gelior had looked upon the Travians with disdain. To them, Travia was a land of decadence and moral decay, a nation that had long abandoned the virtues of restraint and honor. They believed the Travii had traded faith for pleasure, and tradition for comfort. In the eyes of the Geliorians, they were a people who had forgotten the sanctity of their own customs, unworthy of reverence, however gilded their temples, or rich their cities might be. But Gideon had been forced to set aside his prejudice for the sake of ambition. He would do whatever it took to ensure Leon's rise to power. And so, he had decided to marry off their third son, Prince Felix, barely 16 years old, a boy unsuited for battle or leadership, to the niece of the Travian queen. To Gideon, it was a political triumph. To Hannah, it was a sacrifice. The royal hall was quiet, wrapped in the smell of pine resin and smoke. Hannah's steps were soft on the wooden floorboards as she crossed the corridor toward their chamber. The walls were carved with old runes and hunting scenes, half hidden in shadow. Inside, only a few candles burned, their light dancing over beams darkened by years of fire and smoke. Gideon sat at the table, a heavy, rune-bound codex open before him. He looked up when she entered, his broad frame outlined by the flickering light. "Where were you, my love?" he asked, his voice calm but low, like a growl under his breath. "Where I always go," Hannah replied, taking off her fur cloak and hanging it over the chair by the wall. "I was hoping Yanni might hear me this time." Gideon closed the codex, the sound of the heavy cover dull against the wood. He stood and came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist. He was a head taller, his hands rough and warm. Together they looked like a stag caught in the arms of a bear. "You know," he murmured against her hair, "if the gods meant to answer you, they would have done it by now." He spoke softly, almost kindly. "It's not that you don't pray enough, or loud enough. They hear you. They hear all of us, every plea, every thanks, every curse. They just grant the ones that fit what's already meant to be." Hannah turned to face him, her eyes searching his. The candlelight flickered between them. "So, what was meant for me then?" she asked quietly. "To bring children into this world and then lose them?" He frowned slightly. "You haven't lost them, Hannah. One fights in the east for the honor of our name. Another's about to fight for it in Maures. Felix will make us stronger through this new bond. And the youngest, well, he's still a boy. But his time will come too." He spoke with that unshakable confidence she had heard 1,000 times before, the tone of a man who believed the gods had already chosen him for glory. "And that's what you think my life is for?" she asked, her voice steady now. "To give you sons who will win your glory?" He smiled faintly, resting a hand on her cheek. "Not my glory. Ours. That's why the gods brought us together. It was never really about you or me. It was about them, our sons. We were just the start of something greater." He kissed her on the forehead, then let go of her and returned to his seat. The old chair creaked as he sat down and reopened the codex. Candlelight shimmered over the runes as his fingers traced the lines, his voice gone quiet again. The room smelled faintly of pine and smoke. Hannah stood before the tall mirror framed in carved oak, its surface dimly reflecting the candlelight. She loosened the braid that had kept her long red hair bound all day, letting it fall freely down her back. Then, slowly, she began to undo the clasps of her outer dress. Behind her, Gideon still sat at the table, his broad shoulders bent over the old book. The pages were thick, edged with soot and age. "What are you reading?" she asked suddenly, watching his reflection more than him. "The Chronicles," he answered without looking up. "The Chronicles?" she echoed, a small smile in her voice. "Didn't know you'd taken a liking to old texts and dusty stories." "This one's different," he said, his tone steady, serious. "These are the Chronicles of 𝐓𝐿, the record of my clan. Every leader, every war, every betrayal. It's all written here." She raised an eyebrow in the mirror, brushing her hair out of her face. "Since when do you care so much about history?" "Since my family made too many enemies," he said quietly. "I'm trying to see when it started, who we wronged, who might still want to see us fall." Now, dressed in her nightclothes, Hannah crossed the room, her bare feet silent on the wooden floor. Her long hair glimmered in the candlelight as she reached the bed and began to fluff the pillows. "Even if there are enemies," she said softly, "I doubt anyone would dare move against your family. The name of 𝐓𝐚𝐬𝐢𝐜 still makes people shiver all across Gelior." He closed the book for a moment, resting his hands on the cover. "I used to think that too," he admitted. "But the gods don't guard us forever. One day someone will raise a hand against our blood. When that happens, I need to be ready." Hannah gave him a tired, gentle look as she climbed into bed, pulling the heavy fur blanket over herself. "Careful, my love," she murmured. "It's easy to start seeing ghosts everywhere. Sometimes the enemies we fear most are the ones we make in our own minds." He looked up at her then, just for a moment, before she continued, her voice calm but firm. "That's why my family has always prayed to 𝐂𝐤𝐥𝐢𝐴, the god of clear sight and a sober mind, so that pride and fear don't cloud what's real." Gideon said nothing. He only watched the candlelight tremble across the wall, then turned back to the book. Hannah settled deeper beneath the furs, the creak of the timbers and the soft hiss of the fire the only sounds left between them.